Okay, I'm recording this on my phone because my computer camera is broken, so hopefully this comes out okay. So, one of the things that's always interesting to think about in philosophy is what difference would it make if I was wrong about any particular position I hold? And of course, one of the positions that I most firmly endorse is moral anti-realism. So I do sometimes like to think, okay, what difference would it make if realism were true? Like, so what if realism were true? And I always run into this problem of comprehending what that could be, what that could be like. I've sometimes used this example um, of the moral property detector, right? So I say, okay, imagine that we had some sort of machine, right, that could literally somehow detect moral properties. So you can imagine it as like a machine that has, a dial on it, and when you point the machine at people being enslaved, the dial goes to the left, and when you point the machine at people giving to charity, the dial goes to the right. And so we come to think that this machine is detecting moral properties. It's like that means it's really morally wrong, and that means it's morally okay. So in this rather wild scenario where we literally have a moral property detector, maybe that means that I should be a moral realist. And and okay, so there are moral facts, and the moral facts are being detected by the moral property detector. Um, but then I run into this problem of, well, what happens when the moral property detector delivers a result that I disagree with? So let's say that I point the machine at people engaging in deviant sexual behavior, um, where nobody's being, harmed or anything like that. Like like it's just people being weird. Maybe you go to a BDSM club or something, and well, maybe there are people being harmed, depending on how you want to use the term harm. But everybody's having fun. And the machine goes to, it says it's really morally wrong. And you might look at that and initially think, okay, maybe there's some fact that we're missing, right? Maybe there's somebody here who's like HIV positive and is intentionally spreading it to the other people in the club or something like that, right? So you can always imagine that. But let's say no, it just turns out that like perverted sexual behavior is morally wrong. That turns out to be a moral fact. What would I do then? And well, the answer then is um, I don't care, right? That doesn't make any difference to me. I don't see why. Like I don't see why it should make any difference to me. What I would conclude, I think, is okay. There are moral facts, and it turns out that so there are, let's say, objective moral properties. But what's going on here is it's like the external world, the universe is kind of passing moral judgments that I happen to disagree with. So the universe considers it morally wrong to engage in perverted sexual behavior, but I don't. So why should I care? Why should I care that the universe is passing some moral judgment that I don't share? Why is that in principle any different from just some random person passing a moral judgment that I disagree with? Like if I talk to some random person on the street and they start saying that deviant sexual behavior is morally wrong, well, so what? I mean, that's not going to change my values. It's not going to change the sort of behavior that I want to encourage and discourage. I mean, I want to live in a society where we encourage people to engage in perverted sexual behavior. I love all of that stuff. So like, so what? So what if I happen to meet someone on the street who disagrees with me? Well, that's, I mean, a practical problem, right? Because I have the problem of trying to convince them, or at least hoping that they don't gain enough power that they can start influencing things. But beside the practical problem, it doesn't really matter that they disagree with me. That's not going to change my mind. And it's the same with the moral facts. If there are indeed moral facts, I don't see why I should care about that. What really matters doesn't matter to me. And so yeah, I mean, maybe a similar sort of example to this is, suppose you were to meet somebody who endorses divine command theory, and suppose that there really is a God. So the theists are right, and there is a God, and this God is passing judgments about how humans should behave. He's making commands to us. Well, I mean, I guess in that case, we have a kind of moral realism. I mean, we can debate whether divine command theory constitutes moral realism, but certainly, what we would have is that there are like rules being laid down about human behavior, which are stance independent, or at least independent of any human stances, right? Of any human values. So it doesn't matter what we happen to value, what we happen to want. Um, the rules are being laid down by God, and God is independent of us. So that's a kind of moral realism, broadly speaking. Um, so so if this were the case, um, the thing I would ask is, well, like, is there some sort of reward and punishment going on? Because if God is compelling behavior through reward and punishment, well, obviously I care about that. I want to go to heaven. I don't want to go to hell. Okay, so if the divine commands are backed up by reward and punishment, that matters to me. But what if we don't believe in heaven and hell? I mean, there are alternative conceptions of God. Maybe this is just a God who is just like who like everybody gets into heaven, or maybe there is no heaven, maybe there is no afterlife. I mean, there's lots of different metaphysical views here. But let's say there's an omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe. The creator of the universe is passing judgments, but there's no reward or punishment. Um, well, I mean, in that case, God is again just another agent. Um, Again, it's as if God's judgments don't make any difference to what I care about. It's as if I have just selected a person, a random person, and I'm taking their commands as determining the moral facts. And I think that if we are atheists, and I'm aware not all of you are atheists, but for those of us who are atheists, I think that I mean, I might be wrong about this, but I would imagine that we're probably all on the same page here. That the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe who's passive, who's making commands, right? If those commands are not backed up by reward and punishments, so what? Like, who cares? So what if there's a God and he's making commands? It doesn't make any difference to what we care about. It doesn't make any difference to what sort of society we want. It doesn't matter to us. Even if that's what really matters, it's not what matters to us. And certainly, when we use moral language, when we say things like, that's morally wrong, or you ought not to do that, we pass judgments about people's behavior. We're not even trying to describe the commands being made by God. And so it's for me kind of the same when I try to imagine a world in which there are moral facts. There's this. It's like I run up against this wall because I end up just thinking, yeah, but that's just not what I care about. That's not what I'm talking about when I make moral judgments. Now, is this an argument against realism? Well, not in itself. I mean, it's possible to say, yeah, there are moral facts, but I don't care about them, right? Then you would have a moral realism, but you just don't care about what the moral facts are. But I still feel like there's okay, in itself, this isn't an argument against realism, but I can't help feeling like, when it feels like realism misses the point, or like again, when I try to imagine a scenario where there are moral facts, what I suppose is weird to me is that morality is something that matters to us, or at least it's supposed to matter to us. It's what we use. Like, we use it practically. We use it to like negotiate with other people, to resolve conflicts of interest, to guide our behavior, to like when we raise children, we kind of bring them up with certain values, and we want to encourage certain forms of behavior and discourage others. I mean, it's practical, right? And it's about what matters to us. And the idea of there being these mind independent moral facts, or stance independent moral facts, or however you want to put it, I just think, yeah, but I don't care about that. And yet morality is something that I do care about. So that can't be, or at least when I use moral language, right, that's something I care about. So So the very idea of like there being these mind independent moral facts sort of doesn't make sense to me. Um, I mean, certainly, look, I guess, I can use moral language to express my values, to express the things I care about. When I say that something is morally wrong, right, I can use that language as a way of expressing my values. And of course, a whole society could do that. You could have a whole society where everybody is a moral anti-realist, and they're just all using moral language to express their own values. They're not even trying to track the moral facts. Um, when we encounter people who have completely different normative frameworks, or who have completely different values to us, there's two ways to look at it. Um, you could look at it as, okay, those people are expressing different moral views, right? They disagree with us. There's a disagreement about what the facts are. I mean, that's what a realist would say. If I from a sort of liberal society and I encourage deviant sexual behavior, and then I come upon a very traditionalist society that discourages deviant sexual behavior, then we might say, okay, there's a disagreement about the facts. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is you could say, well, this other society with the different values, they just don't care about morality, right? They might be using moral language. They might say the word moral. They might say the words, um, that's morally wrong, or homosexuality is morally wrong. They might say that, right? But they're not really expressing moral concepts because they don't actually care about morality. They have some alternative normative framework, and yeah, they just don't care about morality. This, by the way, is how um, us atheists would seem from the point of view of a divine command theorist, right? So a divine command theorist would say, well, you can use the term moral, and you can use terms like ought and should and so on. So you can engage in moral discourse on a sort of surface level. But if you're not even trying to track what God's commands are, that's not morality, right? That's what a divine command theorist would say. And if you had a society of people where like everybody was a divine command theorist, everybody believed in theism, and everybody thought that everybody interpreted their moral language as attempts to track God's commands, when they encounter us, they just say, yeah, you're using these moral terms, but you're not actually expressing moral concepts. And so we can interpret radically different normative frameworks in the same way. Even if people are using moral language, we can just say, they're not actually even trying to describe moral facts, or they just don't care about morality. Um, and so we I guess you could call it like schmorality, let's say. So we have morality and we have schmorality, and they can just say, well, what we care about is schmorality, not morality. And again, it's like if I was talking to a divine command theorist, I would say, all right, fine. If you want to insist that if you want to insist that moral concepts are a matter of God's commands, fine. I mean, you can have that. Then I don't care about morality. I don't care about that normative framework. That's not what my use of moral language is tracking. When I use moral terms, I'm trying to track schmorality, right? And so it seems like you can always do that when you encounter radically different normative frameworks. Like if you insist that there are moral facts, you can always just say, well, yeah, I don't care about the moral facts. I care about the schmoral facts. Um, so again, I'm not sure. Is this an argument against realism, um, or maybe it's just a feeling that realism misses the point? I mean, I do think that if you are a realist, I guess you should recognize the possibility that you might be radically mistaken about your own moral views. You might be radically mistaken about what the moral facts are. I mean, it's similar to how if you're a realist about the external world, it looks like you should recognize the possibility, the epistemic possibility, that maybe the world is just completely different to what you think. Maybe you are just a brain in a vat. I mean, you might not like have very much credence in that, but realism creates the epistemic possibility of skepticism. I mean, one of the classic reasons why people sometimes end up endorsing anti-realist views is precisely to avoid the problem of skepticism. Because when you're a realist, when you think that there are mind-independent facts that we're tracking, it's always possible we might be going wrong. And so again, this is like a big thing with stuff like external world skepticism, um, and people are pushed to more or less anti-realist views about things precisely to avoid skepticism. But like once you are a realist about some domain, this creates the epistemic possibility that you might be mistaken. Um, and I mean, I think it's one thing to sort of like recognize that intellectually, but it's like, okay, what would you do? Like if it turned out that the moral facts were completely different to what you thought they were, um, would that actually make a difference to you? And I mean, I think we should take this seriously because it's not really that difficult to come up with radically different normative frameworks. I mean, just read somebody like the Marquis de Sade. He has I have a video on the Marquis de Sade that you can check out if you want to see somebody who holds uh, a sort of normative stance that is completely opposed to what most of us would think of as being morally right. Um, but it's not just sort of weird outsiders like the Marquis de Sade. You can look at other societies. I mean, if you were to look at the moral values of Roman societies, that's I guess based more on like codes of honor, tradition, respect for authority. There's not so much concern about like reducing suffering or individual rights or anything like that. So these are radically different normative frameworks. Even within our own moral tradition, it's not too difficult to take what many people take as being kind of obvious moral principles and then show that these actually entail results that are completely opposed to common sense moral thinking. So take something like negative utilitarianism. Well, I mean, that's a lot of people find that kind of framework quite plausible. But there's there's a reasonable argument that negative utilitarianism entails that we should just kill everybody. Like maybe the morally right thing for me to do is to just go out and kill as many people as I can. Now, of course, the negative utilitarian will have ways around that. I should say negative utilitarianism. I'm using this to refer to the view that we ought to minimize pain and suffering. Right, like that's it. The goal is just to minimize pain and suffering. It doesn't put any weight on maximizing pleasure. So from that sort of point of view, okay, if I just go out and just kill the first person I see, I mean, I've significantly minimized suffering, probably because if I kill a 30-year-old, well, maybe they've got like 50 years of life left, at least expected. And I'm relieving them of all of that suffering in the 50 years. And there are ways around this kind of conclusion. I mean, you can always say, well, if I kill that person, that's going to cause suffering to their loved ones. But, I mean, like everybody dies eventually, right? I mean, so that suffering is going to happen anyway. I mean, the suffering of loved ones when you die is going to happen anyway eventually. And I mean, if I go out and kill somebody quickly, well, actually, that might involve much less suffering than normal deaths because if somebody dies over time of like cancer or Alzheimer's, I mean that can be horrific. That's horrible. That's a lot of suffering over a long period of time. I just go out, I kill somebody, boom, no suffering. Well, very little suffering relative to no more suffering for them and very little suffering for other people relative to what they might have with other common forms of death and illness. So I feel like this has become about negative utilitarianism, and that wasn't my point. My point was just, there are moral frameworks that we take seriously that may well entail completely different conclusions to what we thought. And again, so then the question is, well, what if it turned out that the negative utilitarians were right? Like if you're a moral realist and those are the moral facts, like what would you do with that information? Would you think that we should go out and just kill everybody? I mean, to me, that seems crazy. I mean, that seems like an absurd conclusion. But the problem with this is that I have spoken to realists who just accept, who just kind of accept this. So they're just like, well, yeah. I mean, if it turned out that that it was a moral fact that um, it's a stance independent moral fact that I ought to just go out and kill the next person I see, then yeah, that's what I ought to do morally. But it's again, it's like, yeah, but really, would you do that? I mean, like, I mean, maybe you wouldn't do it for other, for because people, I guess realists will acknowledge that people do not always kind of perform their moral duties, right? But even so, like I mean, it's again, it just comes back to this point that like, yeah, but when we're talking about moral rules, we're talking about practical issues. We're talking about how to negotiate conflicts of interest. We're talking about the sorts of behaviors we want to encourage in people. So if you say to me that it's a moral fact that I should just go out and kill as many people as I can, in order to prevent suffering, well, like no, that's not the kind of world I want to live in. That's not what I'm talking about when I make moral claims. Um, but yeah, I have met realists and in fact anti-realists who just kind of accept this, and they'll say, yeah, if you could show me that there are moral facts and that the moral facts are different to what my moral beliefs are, then I would just change my mind and I would act on that as best I can. So I don't really know. Yeah, I don't really know what to do with that. I mean, at the end of the day, if that's your stance, then fair enough. But I do find it puzzling, and so I don't really have a conclusion to this. Um, I'm just gonna leave the video here. I think this is long enough, and that's all for now. Okay, so yeah, goodbye.